Hey, what's up everybody? Rob Marzullo here, Ram Studio Comics. Welcome back. So a long-awaited video. I've been requested multiple times to do hand poses. So we're going to go ahead and draw through these in time-lapse. Then I'm going to convert to real time and draw through them and talk about the main takeaways and what I learned from each pose in each study. So without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so as we know, hand poses can be extremely complex, and there's just a ton of varieties of shapes that the hand can conform to and create. It's one of the reasons why it's so expressive. So one of the things I like to start with is a very basic pose like this first one, an open hand gesture, just because it allows you to kind of warm up. So don't jump right in and start doing the ultra complex poses because it might discourage you. So just really start with the basic, get a feel for it, and then segue into something more complex from there. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and study this pose and see what we can learn from it. So if you notice, the fingers are actually a bit rounded like this. Now they're almost like overlapping ovals. So just remember that. That's a real simplistic interpretation of it, but it's kind of easy to remember. It's easy to bend that concept and get foreshortening. And then you just have to worry about the overlap like that. Another relationship that's really prevalent, as you could see as I was sketching, I actually create this effect in the sketch because there's a relationship from the knuckle, which should be a little bit more prevalent in the sketch here, but the knuckle from the thumb to the knuckles of the top portion of the hand, to the tip of the thumb, to the knuckles, the first row of knuckles, and the fingers. And likewise, even though this one's bent, the relationship of the knuckles here. Now the tips of the fingers take their own kind of direction, and obviously the middle finger is the most prevalent, ring finger next, and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit different, but if you get this nice curvature of the knuckles, it really makes constructing the hand a lot easier to do, especially in expressions where the hand starts to move more complex. The curves will still help you out tremendously. It's also equally as well to notice that there's a relationship from the pinky to the thumb. Even though they're very different in shape and structure, you'll notice if you put those together on your own hand that they line up almost perfectly. So again, it's memorizing little relationships and things like that in the hand that'll make constructing it and redrawing it a lot easier to do. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to that next pose. Alright, so for this next hand pose, I want to show you a little bit more of how it's easier to construct the hand by first drawing the lengths. So that's that little stickman kind of look with the dots and the lines, and then of course the curvature for the relationship of the knuckles. But by first defining the lengths, then becomes a lot easier to draw over the proportions, which you see me doing there, and then finally clean up the line work and make any additional changes. So that's pretty much the way that I like to construct almost all of my hand poses and even most of my figure drawing. Okay, so now for this hand pose, the main thing that I would say to pay attention to something like this is really the way that the thumb works. So kind of the neat thing about the thumb is that the one knuckle is pretty much hidden in here, and the way that it constructs is it's almost, I would say, three main masses of this kind of structure with the bend of the knuckle here. And because of its ability to oppose and move across, it can create all sorts of dynamic shapes, and it's really just important to really take note and structure of the way the thumb works here. Past that, again, like I talked about, the relationship of the knuckles is always really important to take note of. And then I guess next with this pose, the thing that I would focus on the most is the way that the pads work. So you have the pads of the hand up here, and then as the hand compresses, you see it makes these nice little wrinkles right there, and it really shows the way that it functions based on that. So a lot of people I've noticed with their hands, they'll forget to really incorporate enough room for the pads and the way these work here. And then likewise, the way that the thumb will connect and web out to the side of the hand there. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to that next pose. Okay, so now for this hand pose, we'll get a little bit more of the back of the hand, and it'll look like it's pretty much directing downward towards something. And so this allows us to pay more attention to the knuckles and the structure of the back of the hand. And again, it's very important to just try a variety of these poses because each one is going to teach you something, and you're not just going to get good at hands overnight. It's going to take hundreds, if not thousands of attempts. And I don't mean to discourage you there, but I just want you to be ready that it is hard work, but it is very worth it. Hands are just very much part of a story, so you need to get good at them to tell that story. Okay, so from this particular angle, one of the things that kind of resonates with me the most, I would say, is kind of this basic primitive shape that you can see here. So if you were to draw through this, you could see that it's kind of a square in perspective along with a triangular wedge-like shape off to the side. And it really helps to, again, see through your work and see these basic primitive shapes, because anything that will allow you to memorize it and then draw it from the mind is important. And to me, that's the most noticeable aspect. Likewise, you could consider each one of these to be cylinders with small ovals for the knuckles. One thing that I think is important is to remember to draw the knuckle both rounding in both directions. It just never seems to look accurate when someone will try to illustrate it and just round in one direction. Unless you're going for an animated style, then that's more than fine. But just remember that the knuckle does round in both directions, and it will help to give a more natural appearance to the fingers. Now the other thing is, always remember that the fingernails are a great way to immediately give perspective to the direction that the fingers are facing. They're really a great device for making the illustration immediately look more dynamic and more well done, and it's actually pretty easy. So if you have a fingertip like this, it becomes very easy to just draw a fingernail like this and put a few little bends, and all of a sudden it looks a lot more dimensional. So the fingernails are a great kind of tool almost for quickly illustrating that. And the other thing to pay attention to is the curvature of the thumb. It's real easy to get wrong, and I struggle with this constantly. But just the right bend and smoothness to the way the thumb kind of tapers towards the point is really important to note, and it will allow you to get a more natural feel to the structure of the hand as well. All right, so let's move on to that next pose. Okay, so for the next hand pose, again, the same fundamental rules apply for defining the lengths and then drawing the proportions over top. Now keep in mind, certain hand poses are going to be a little bit trickier for you. This one was tricky for me, and maybe this one would be easy for you and another one will be hard for you. You really never know until you get into it. But one of the things I do want to touch on is just to really attack the ones that are hard for you head on. I think you learn more by that process, so don't shy away from it and only draw the hands that you're comfortable with drawing. And again, I just want to stress that if you only work on the poses that are comfortable to you, you're never going to get past those mental barriers. And the whole reason we're doing studies like these is to break those mental barriers and to really expand your perspective on the way that things like this work. So, for instance, with the hand here, one of the things that I always seem to notice is the way that the fingers can sometimes take their own, or almost always take their own direction from one another. And that's really important to notice, because if not, you'll end up drawing fingers and hands that look like this. And I think every artist kind of does this at first, and they constantly struggle and wonder why their hands look too static or too mechanical. And this is one of the reasons, that the middle finger kind of takes its own direction. The ring finger goes a little bit different. These two kind of stick together in a lot of poses, so you'll notice that. The pinky oftentimes will go kind of on its own, and we all know the thumb can do a lot of opposable movements. So everybody expects that from the thumb, but they forget that each one of these fingers also have a little bit different ability to point and direct from one another. Past that, the other tricky thing about a pose like this, like I mentioned, is that the thumb, when it gets in the front, it becomes a whole nother shape like this. And although that's great for depth, and that you want overlaps like this to create good depth in your work, it becomes a little bit trickier to envision, and you start to sometimes, what's real popular with young artists is they'll forget to draw through properly. So that's where lines like this through your work will help you to not let something that's blocking your work change your perception on the way you should be drawing it. Okay, so let's go ahead and move to that next pose. Alright, so now for this next hand pose, this is a really popular gesture and one that I think is very important to practice and get just right. This is a pointing pose, so it tells a lot of story. It's really great for comics and really any kind of visual story medium. And it's really easy to get wrong as well, probably because it's so recognizable, like a lot of these poses, that it's just really easy to pinpoint what's not right about the pose, like not getting the knuckles fanning out just properly, and then not getting the right relationship from the thumb to where it connects to the fingers and kind of holds them into place. All right, so now, like I was saying about the knuckles fanning out properly, the tricky part is getting it to where they look like they're actually changing direction. So there's a little bit of a fanning that occurs with a lot of hand poses that's important to note. Even with a closed fist, you should get in the habit of drawing the knuckles more in this type of fashion than, again, this straight across kind of fashion like this. So from an angle like this fanning motion now looks to turn, let me erase this line here so you can see it better, into something like that. So that's an important thing to note. Likewise with the pointer finger, especially with something you're trying to be a little bit more expressive with, you could almost draw it more like this and really push that curvature of the bend of each segment to the finger. And then a real tricky part as far as the thumb is getting just the right direction of the thumb to where it connects and holds into place. And as far as positioning, you can always check by making these hand poses and getting used to really looking down at your hand or looking at a mirror. It's very important. And you'll get the right relationships from where the thumb ends and connects to, maybe the next part of the knuckles where it meets there, things like that. But it's really that direction that the thumb takes and how it's at a different angle altogether is really the tricky part to get right. And then again, that webbing, the way it connects to the hand is really important to show, and little things like that. You can go back to the ovals like we talked about earlier, and cylinders, whatever makes it easier to construct it. And let me just say too, give yourself lots of construction lines. The more the better. You can always soft erase them down, and I always look at this information as food for thought. So give yourself lots of food for thought and lots of sketch lines to work from. Okay, so for our last pose, the ever popular thumbs up, very expressive pose obviously. And for this one, I actually held my right hand up, and I'm left-handed, so I drew with my left obviously. And this actually made it even a bit trickier, so it's just an exercise, sometimes in futility, to just kind of strengthen my skill set and see what I can do. But it does add another variable into the mix, so I think it made it just a tad harder than normal to accomplish. So let's go ahead and talk about that one. Okay, so now with this one, one of the reasons why I did it this way and why I think it's still a good exercise, even though, like I said, it made it a little bit trickier for me, but it's still a good thing to get in the habit of, is because, well, for instance, I didn't have to search for any reference. I didn't have to take any photos. I'm just able to hold my hand up. For instance, I keep a mirror by my art table, and for complex poses that are directed towards the viewer, something like that, I'll use that mirror. And it does become tricky to do, but it's really just an integral part of a workflow for an artist, and I think it's important to practice. Now, that being said, I think that there are some issues with the fanning, like I told you about. I think it could have been a little bit more prevalent. One of the things that happens from a pose like this, and you can tighten your own fists and really take notice of it, besides it fanning a bit more than I have here, the pinky will really start to tuck in and start to actually direct more into the center of the palm. Again, this goes with how much the hand is compressed, so just study that to really get the idea of that. The other thing that I notice is, like I said before on the previous sketch of a hand, the thumb is always very tricky to get just the right curvature, and it's very noticeable when it's not right. So I think that the curvature of the thumb could have been more like this, more of a slope in here. Now obviously for more stylized renditions, you can really take that another level and really become ultra expressive with the way that these lines move and things like that. And then also taking note of the way that the hand directs and the segments through the direction and the way that the pads change back here. So little things like that. So that's about it for the 6 hand poses. So I appreciate you watching, and hopefully this has been beneficial to you. If it has, be sure to give me a thumbs up and a like and all that good stuff. So more video content is on the way. Please subscribe, and I will talk to you soon.